Hello, good morning. What a privilege it is to be with you today in this gorgeous place of creation together. And also a privilege to be invited by the Royal Society to be part of the conversation about what do we want social justice to look like in the 21st century. And yes, my topic is about that other inconvenient truth of our era, intergenerational income inequality, because income inequality has become one of those topics that you can't duck anymore. And instead of talking about the diversity of experience, I want to talk about the cross-cutting element of the experience of income inequality as affecting the young people in this room and by consequence, all of our future path in the 21st century. Did I get that wrong? So what am I doing wrong? Oh, yeah, I'm doing the green one. Oh, shit. There we go. Wait, is that my first slide? Yeah, that is my first slide. Okay. All right, here we go. So I want to talk about identity, class, and inequality. What? Oh, yeah. Thanks, Judy. Jesus. I could never do a TED Talk, eh? I've already used up half a minute? Holy. The last half century was all about identity politics. I'm going to submit to you that the next half century is going to be, yet again, just like 100 years ago, about class politics. The reason for it is because when Occupy came out after the crisis, for a brief shining moment, Occupy reminded us that the game is rigged. And we keep seeing evidence that the game is rigged. We have massive system malfunction on every level: economic, political, social, environmental. And if the game is rigged, we have to unrig it. So the debate of our era is who does what, for how much, and just exactly how much are you worth? So the last 50 years has been about this progressive era of identity politics. You know, a colleague of Grace Edwards and Judy's and mine in Toronto, Uzma Shakir, says, newcomers are told in Canada, leave your baggage at the door. And she says, we are our baggage. Right? That's true of all of us. If you don't know your history, you don't know who you are. And so what identity politics was talking about is, who am I and how do I fit in? Starting with the civil rights movement in the 50s, then the women's movement in the 60s, the gay rights movement that started off in the 70s and moved to the LGBT movement, and now Aboriginal rights and idle no more. In terms of identity politics, the question has always been, why is this happening to me? And the answer has always been systemic discrimination, because what we're looking for when we are looking at this conversation is about how Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the long arc of history moving us towards justice, towards greater inclusion. The search for millennia has been how we recognize, as Chief Atleo said, our essential equality and equivalence, that we are different, but we are the same. And the solution to the identity politics question was social, not individual change. You didn't change who you were. Society changed its response to you. And the challenge of identity politics has always been to deliver on the promise of meritocracy, that the best rises to the top, that we are all included in the opportunity to be the best, and that the goal is prosperity for everyone. Well, class politics is completely about something else. And by class, I don't mean working class versus the rentier class, though that's starting to come out too in current discussions economically. What I'm talking about is what's happening at the top, the 1%. What's happening in the middle? Is the middle class getting hollowed out? What's happening at the bottom? And I don't mean just the poor, but this growing flood of people that are at the bottom and getting left behind. And the question is, again, why is it happening? And the regular things that are marshaled here are globalization, technology, and the fact that people are losing bargaining power. And yes, identity matters in the issue of bargaining power and your leverage. Now, the solution in this era is not a social solution. It's about you be a better you. In fact, Chief Atleo talked about it. Education is the solution, right? You get out there and be a better you and work harder. And indeed, you know, if you don't think education is a solution, try ignorance, right? You need education to be the best possible you. But what we're seeing with the numbers I'm going to show you in a little while is this goes beyond you being the best you. We actually need us describing what is happening across the whole system and how many people are getting behind. The reality is that there are fewer jobs in the middle. There is more short-term work and temporary jobs, and what we need is system change. And the challenge becomes the same challenge as identity politics. How do you deliver the promise of prosperity for everyone? How do you make good on the promise of meritocracy, where the best will rise to the top and everybody has the opportunity to be the best? And when we talk about the 1%, we realize something systemic is going on. This was a sign during Occupy, and it has led to an awakening of sorts. That something very significant is happening that is different than our concern about poverty and people getting left behind. There's a concern about what's happening to the top and that they are breaking away from the rest of us. And that changes the relationship of everyone with one another, right? It actually changes the balance that Chief Atleo was talking about. Inequality debates, as I said earlier, have become something you cannot duck in 2013. We're having an election based on it in Toronto Centre, but it is the mayor of New York just got elected with a landslide vote, 73% of the vote, talking about 2 cities within one in New York City. Right? Inequality is a defining feature of our era, and the more inequality talk comes to the center of all of our discussions about the future, the more it becomes, creates space for the income inequality deniers. Just like the climate change deniers, they're crawling out of the woodwork everywhere. The arguments here are, it's really not about inequality, it's about poverty. We don't care what happens at the top, we care what happens about the bottom and people being left behind. For the people that say, no, actually the 1% does make a difference, the debate is, it's not about inequality, it's about envy. When you talk about the 1%, you're just envious. Or it's not about inequality, it's about opportunity. We want everybody to have the right opportunity to be the best and the brightest. Or it's not about inequality, it's actually about skill shortages and mismatches. That's why the system is operating so poorly. And then the final argument is actually, it's not a big deal in Canada, but you can't do much about it anyway. So I want to go through this. Just yesterday, is it yesterday? Yeah. No, maybe it was 2 days ago. 2 days ago, when Finance Minister Flaherty did his economic and fiscal update, he actually said, we don't have to worry about poverty. He said poverty's at the lowest rate ever on record. So awesome, Canada's doing great, we don't need to worry about poverty. This is the chart he's talking about. This is what Andrew Coyne talks about. This chart is a measure of poverty that was adjusted, the last time it was adjusted was in 1992. So based on 1992, look, all the trends are down. Because all these track records for the red line is child poverty, the green line is adult working age poverty, the purple line is elderly poverty. And you can see for elderly, we actually licked it, didn't we? It's almost disappeared. We practically don't have any poor old people left, right? Child poverty, wow, awesome. You know, it's gone up, it went up during both recessions, but it's down at the lowest level ever. And adult poverty, well, it's kind of where it was in the mid-1970s, but it's not worse. So when Flaherty says we don't have to worry about poverty, this is the argument. It's not about inequality, it's about poverty. And hey, look, we don't have to worry about poverty. Awesome. But these are the numbers that the OECD is using that has become the touchstone. This low income measure is the way we now measure poverty for the 8 provinces in this country that have got a poverty reduction strategy and the 3 territories. It's the way the OECD counts it. It's a completely different measure. It's much simpler to calculate. And there you see that the purple line again is the elderly. We licked elderly poverty from the 1970s to the mid-1990s, primarily because of social policies, but also because women started working more, and I'll get back to this later. And it's been climbing ever since. For adult poverty, for working age poverty, it's higher now than it was in the mid-1970s, and for child poverty, it's exactly where it was in the late 1970s. It is lower than it was in 1989 when every federal party stood up and declared that by the year 2000 they would eliminate child poverty, which was a scourge in a country that is as wealthy as ours. Well, we have barely made a dent in it, though we've had record-breaking job growth for at least a decade in that period. So this is what, when people in Parliament bang their fists on the table and go shame, this is a shameful chart because Canada is the 11th largest economy in the world, and we can do anything we want. And there's no reason why we can't eliminate poverty. As Chief Atleo said, if we want to do something, we've got all the resources in the world to do it. When people talk about the top 1% is about envy, I want to show you this. It's more like a culture shift because in the decade before the crisis, which is the last line on this chart, the top 1% got almost a third of all the income gains in our economy. That was a decade where Canada was the job juggernaut of the G7. Our economy grew faster and we created more jobs than any other economy of the biggest economies in the world. And the rich took a third of all that income gain. And if you think that's normal, in a similar period of economic growth, the top 1% took 8%. So that's 4 times more than in the last period of rapid expansion. And it's almost twice as much as during the roaring 20s. My friends, we are in an uncharted territory. So to be told there's something about envy going on here misses the boat. We are in a new period of where the top 1% are entitled to taking the lion's share of income growth, and everybody else is told for companies to be profitable, they need to accept less. The other inconvenient truth of our era is that the middle class is shrinking. Or is it? This is a chart that's used by Stephen Gordon, an economist at Laval, to make the point, actually, no, we don't have to worry about the middle class because, look, it's back to where it was again. So if you take a look at the blue line, it's slightly higher than it was after taxes and transfers in the mid-1970s. But the truth is, in the mid-1970s, there was most people in the middle class had 1 earner. Now we have 2 earners. We're roughly back to where we were in the mid-1970s. And more people are devoting huge amounts of money and time to becoming better educated. And consequently, there's a lot more student debt to be able to get into and stay in the middle. And you need 2 people to do it. Is this something to celebrate, that it didn't get hollowed out? The reason why the middle class didn't get hollowed out in Canada is because more so than in the United States, Canadian women rolled up their sleeves and started working more and getting a better education. There is one group that is really stunning with regards to this story. That is young Aboriginal women. Their rate of achievement of university education outpaces any other group amongst women. But the overall story is that women worked more than men. Yeah, seriously, big up. Women worked more than men. They rolled up their sleeves. The big transformation in society is one woman staying at home raising her kids versus you have to be out there working to help raise your kids. It's from 1 income earner to 2 income earners. But the strategy that saved the middle class in the last generation is not available to the next generation because you young people that are sitting in the room, you young women and young men are more alike than any previous generation. You're going to school, you're getting educated, you're working. But if you're starting off at the same place, women can't suddenly find a reserve army of hours of work that don't exist. I mean, you're starting off at the same place. So the strategy of the last generation isn't available for the next generation. And what we see is that the youngest generation has lost the most ground. So 25 to 34-year-olds have lost the most ground, even though they're better educated than their counterparts, which is my age group, the boomers. And the boomers have done the best. So the people that were 45 to 54-year-old back in the 1970s, these aren't the same people, it's the same age tranche, they've seen the biggest increase of incomes. Young people have seen the biggest decrease of incomes, and yet young people are better educated than ever before. Meantime, the number of job opportunities right smack dab in the middle, from 30,000 to 60,000, has shrunk since the mid-1970s. The group of jobs that has increased has been under $30,000 a year, as well as over $60,000 a year. So educate yourself all you want. There's fewer opportunities in the middle. And those with a university degree, again, I'm not saying that education isn't the solution for all sorts of reasons, but when it comes to the labor market, the employment rate of those at the top with university degrees is falling. I'm not talking about how much money you'll make. I'm talking about your chance of even having a job is falling over time with a university degree. Now, this is the highest employment rate of any group. So this gets you a leg up in the game, but compared to a generation ago, less of a leg up. And finally, there's two more charts about the rise of the temps. So this is a chart that shows that since 1997, which is as far back as we can go, there has been more creation of temporary jobs than permanent jobs. That's partly because there's way more permanent jobs. But since the crisis, see that little kind of giraffe neck up there in dotted lines? Since the crisis, the fastest rate of job growth has been with temporary jobs. And the people that are sucking it up the most is the next generation of worker. So as you know, there's all these unpaid internships, but as you get jobs, the jobs are more likely to be 6 months, 1 year, sometimes unreliable, you're on casual, you get called up when they need you, don't call me, we'll call you. This is the new normal for, I often think about what's happening here as the youth are the shock troops of the new normal in the labor market, where your relationship to a job is less career and defining of who you are as just being available for the employer. And that's partly because we're flooding the low-end, entry-level end of the labor market with temporary foreign workers. That red line, so you'll see since the crisis, that number just kept going up. These are temporary foreign workers. The numbers that are swelling the most are those in the so-called low-skill pilot project. You heard about it when RBC got caught with their hands in the cookie jar, training some guy that had been in IT for 30 years, training somebody from India how to do his job so that they could export it to India. Right? This is what temporary foreign workers are for. RBC said, wasn't me. They said, it's our supplier that's doing this. But the instinct is still the same, to outsource jobs to places where other people can do it. So I want to say that this really is all about you, young people in the audience. There is a generation shock going out there. Chief Atlia referenced it very briefly. You probably aren't going to make as much as your parents' generation as a generation goes. Your job is probably not going to be a definition of your identity. And you are becoming more aware that what you consume could consume you. The way we're consuming things is making a huge difference. Our democratic institutions, whether they're unions or politics, really don't speak to you or work for you. So how are you going to respond in the 21st century? How are you going to talk about social justice by yourself or with others, by pushing changes in business or pushing changes in government? What instruments are you going to use to seek social justice? Well, here's some things that you can do by yourself, because everybody wants to know, as in climate change, what can I do about this? How can you change income inequality by yourself? Well, start small. Break a little taboo. Who talks about how much they make? Talking about how much we make is probably the last thing people want to talk about. So talk about how much you make and talk about what other people make. When you stand at a cash register at a grocery store, ask that person how much they make. How much do they make an hour? How much do they make a week? Are they able to get the hours they need? And demand a reality check every time you read a story in a newspaper or hear it on the air. When the media starts talking about how much a CEO makes or what the profit margins are, ask them, where are they getting their profits from? How are the people that are generating the profit for that business getting paid? Where are the jobs? Are they in Canada? Are they someplace else? How much does the lowest paid worker make in comparison to the top? And oh, by the way, are there any unpaid interns helping you generate your profit? Or you could decide that you want to work with others, a few at a time. When a privileged economy feels like system failure, we have to crank up the alternatives. We've got a bag at Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives that says we've got policy alternatives in the bag. But what I'm learning when I do my Metro morning session is how many of these initiatives in the alternative economy is coming from 20 and 30 somethings. I've learned more in the last 6 months about the maker and the hacker culture, where people are becoming prosumers. They are producing the stuff that they are consuming. They are not happy about just buying stuff on the market, partly because they can't afford it, and partly because they have figured out how to hack systems. This is a new form of economy, as is the sharing economy. So you might have heard about Airbnb. You can't afford a hotel? Well, there's people out there that will, let you rent a room in their house. The sharing economy has become enormous in Toronto. We've opened up a tool library as well as a kitchen library. Can't afford the machine? Borrow it from the library And if you really, really need it, if you find you use it a lot, then you can buy it. But the idea of like breaking down the consumer culture is coming from 20 and 30-year-olds. And also it's coming, a new form of organizing is emerging where we're looking at maybe the end of movements as my generation knew it, whether it's the civil rights movement or the women's movement or, you know, the green movement, and more like coming together in flash mobs. Think about what happened during the No Pirogue thing. Think about how Idle No More is taking over. This isn't about movements that go for years and have specific asks. What was the failure of Occupy? What is the one thing you want? We couldn't articulate what was the one thing we wanted. But it doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of new moment happening in how people converge unexpectedly, because that's what social media allows you to do, like swarms, like flashes, and being able to push back against something. And what we can do together, all together now, is at least not make things worse. We can change the temporary foreign worker program. We can stop new tax cuts, which rob us of the necessary resources we need to make the necessary investments in our society. We can stop undermining collective bargaining, because if you can't bargain with others, you don't have bargaining power. You might be the most amazing person in the world, but the fact is that you are a David against the Goliaths that are out there. You've got to bring yourself together and do collective bargaining if you're going to change the system. And we have to stop chronically underinvesting in the infrastructure that Chief Atleo and others have talked about. It isn't just about clean water. It isn't just about education. It isn't just about roads. It's about all of it, and we haven't been doing it for too long. And there are things we can do on our to-do list. There's a group called WageMark. It's starting to talk about the ratio between the top and the bottom. It would be like an assertion that your business is actually interested in the welfare of the worst paid person as well as the top paid person. Costco is a great example of how you can be a hugely profitable corporation and have a completely different business model than Walmart. You're doing the same thing. You're offering big box, cheap stuff to people, but you're paying people well and giving them vacations and making it explicit that you've got a relationship between the top and the bottom that respects. We need to do more time and support for people, because if everybody's working, who's taking care of the kids? How are you upgrading your own skills? How are you volunteering and giving back to your community? The idea of what you are devoted to. When your employer isn't devoted to you, but you have to be devoted to work, there's something awry there. And time has to be part of the balance we're seeking. And of course, better places to live. And this is my last slide. So social justice in the 21st century means full employment, and not just of jobs, but of our potential. Full engagement, which includes getting your ideas and your voice out into the marketplace of ideas and policy choices. And responsible investing, which brings us back into balance, where we're valuing people, communities, and the planet as we plan our economic growth. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Armine, I am reminded, of course, of what David did to Goliath. Think of Caravaggio's paintings. Three very stimulating and provocative presentations. And so we are now open to questions. Once again, we do need to use the microphones because of the podcast and the web use. There's a microphone here. And there's a microphone there. Are there questions or comments? There's a question, I'm sorry, there's a question over here. And I think, and there's a question in the middle there as well. So we'll start on the right, and then let's take both of those questions and then let our panelists respond. Please, go ahead.
Yeah, three very good speeches. Thank you very much. Keith Heipel from the University of Waterloo. Just for the last speaker, maybe another way to say what you just said is we need long-term planning, but we need value added to everything that we do. Value added to education, value added to our resources, etc. Now, the Canadian Academy of Engineering came out with a report you can get online. It was in the Globe and Mail. If we process all the oil in Canada, that's a $60 billion value added, rather than building the pipelines, processing in the States and China. I wonder if you'd like to comment upon that further. Somehow we need value added.
Thank you. Let's take the second question first, and then we'll let the panel respond. Please go ahead.
So my name is Gustavo Caballero from the University of Calgary, and my question is to Armine. So you talk about one alternative is about opportunities instead of inequality, but I think you didn't address it that much. I guess in partly because, in a sense, income is determining your opportunities, meaning it's determining what resources you had when you were growing up. But I would like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts regarding the importance of opportunities instead of inequality by itself.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take those two questions and responses. Who would like to begin? Armine?
Okay, so I don't know if you noticed at the bottom of every one of my slides, I had my Twitter handle. So it's Armine Yalnizyan, just the way my name is spelt, and the discussion about refineries. Andrew Leach, who is at University of Alberta in Edmonton, and I were just going back and forth about that. There is an economic argument that says we should not be refining here because of cost considerations, and they're primarily because of labor costs, from what I can tell. So if you can actually refine more cheaply someplace else, why wouldn't the company do that? And I think we are in this era where the economic paradigm of where is the cheapest place to produce stuff has not left us yet. And we're not connecting the dots between the fact that you might actually have the same profits by not upgrading, by simply extracting, which is the argument he was making. You make exactly the same profits, irrespective of which of the two things you do, but you don't distribute the profits in the form of wages and jobs if you don't upgrade more. And the idea that we're not connecting these dots is, I think, very significant in the discussion we need to make about the balance we are looking for, that it isn't just about pulling stuff out of the ground and taking it to the cheapest place to produce. That's the overriding narrative, especially in an era of slow economic growth where everybody's looking for cheap. Everybody in this room is looking for the cheapest T-shirt, the cheapest shoes, the cheapest everything they can find because we are income constrained. And the flip side of every low price is a low wage. And sometimes low wages means you don't get to work at all. So that goes to my opportunity question. The only thing that I had in my slide deck about opportunity is that the range of opportunities in the $30,000 to $60,000 earning slice is shrinking over time. So there is not a hollowing out of the middle, but fewer opportunities. It's more like a barbell economy where you're getting stuck at the bottom. A lot of people are overqualified for the jobs that are at the bottom, and there's nothing to really move forward to. Those jobs are really not there to help you build your skill base or move up anywhere. So the more we kind of strangle the options in the middle, the more it means it's harder for people with great qualifications to get properly employed and to move up. Also, it means that if you lose your job at the top, you have a lot further to fall. So we have a stake in creating more employment opportunities in the middle. But as you said, income circumscribes the kind of opportunities you are likely able to invest in your children. For example, if both parents are working or you've got a single parent working, you're going to have less investment in that child's ability to learn how to read, do extracurriculars, that there's less supervision. There's any number of ways in which we invest in our children that higher income people can do more easily than lower income people. And given that we are facing labor shortages and all sorts of strains with an aging population, we're going to need all hands on deck. So we really do need to invest much more heavily in the next generation. And if you take a look at all the policies that are out there right now that the politicians are offering, that are putting on, they're way more worried about older people getting older than young people being able to reach their full potential. We need to change that dialogue.
Grace, Edward, or Tasha, would you like to comment or respond to either of the questions?
I just wanted to say in the whole debate between extraction versus refinery, value added, all of that, I'm just reminded of the last thing you said about responsibility to the planet. And that's always something I think about how to reconcile that with economic growth. And I guess when we talk about the cost of pulling stuff out of the ground, I think what needs to be mentioned is the human cost that comes to the extraction industries. And I'm talking about those people, usually, but not always, Indigenous people who are being affected very, profoundly at the loss of life to, how to factor that into an economic system. Yeah. What is the cost of human life that's lost as a result? And we can talk about tar sands or fracking or any of the other extraction industries. How does that factor in?
So I just want to add that I think a system change approach to dealing with the crises, the multiple crises that we find ourselves in, can benefit substantially from us reflecting on what Indigenous people have been saying to us with regard to our relationship to the land. And I think that is a critical lesson that those of us who are settlers on this land really need to take to heart.
Thank you very much. We could take some additional questions then now, please. Yes, go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. So I'm Rita Roy from the University of Calgary. My question is more for the first two presenters, but I would love to hear all three of your perspectives. And it's in regards to this sort of the coalition, I guess, of anti-racism, or I guess coalition more broadly of about this, around this idea of non-dominant racial identity and the social exclusion that comes from that. On one hand, obviously, all people who are non-dominant in racial identity, whether that be ethnic minorities or Indigenous people or whatever, they're sort of united in terms of that social exclusion piece. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of diversity in that big category of other. And I know within Aboriginal communities, there has been some concern expressed about being lumped in with other ethnic minorities because of some of the unique issues. And I guess that could apply to other subgroups as well. So could you maybe comment a little bit about how to navigate that tension between the diversity, but also the fact that there is this unifying social exclusion as well? So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Panelists?
Oh, I think we're taking the... You go.
Oh, okay.
Natasha, please.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that one of the there's two things happening, I think, in the sense that what gets erased continually is the status within Indigenous peoples and the relationship to land, and more specifically land rights. And I think that that's the narrative that continues to be erased. And absolutely, there's shared experiences. Absolutely, there's a non-white experience, and that goes into many different, whether it's income, whether it's treatment, whether it's justice, whether it's law. All of those things do factor in. But I think there is the onus on Canadians in general and also newcomers to understand that relationship to land, to understand the tie to the land that existed prior to the visitors arriving. And I think I've done a little bit of work around that, around just starting a dialogue, right? I think a lot of times that's when you talk about navigating diversity, that begins with dialogue. That begins with, because I know from what I've been told that newcomers to Canada get the dominant narrative around Indigenous peoples, and that's all they get. And so, that those sorts of systems get replicated. And I think that, to overturn that starts with that dialogue, and starts with the onus on all of us to educate ourselves about each other, not just the other, but each other.
Thank you. Grace Edward?
So I would argue that to constitute or reconstitute the kind of racial justice coalition that I was talking about, I think we need to do a couple of things. One is that we need to root it in history, which means that we need to recover all of the erasures and invisibilities that have been structured by our history and how they play out to this day. Because I think if we did that, then we would construct different types of relationships, both within the categories within which we tend to find ourselves, as well as across categories. Secondly, is I think we need to take seriously the intersectional analysis. I think that is a critical piece. That is something perhaps new and different from the previous coalition. An acknowledgement that we live our lives in diverse identities, and that those diverse identities both structure our lives and structure access to opportunity and structure our possibilities, particularly for young people. and that we need to open up that space so that they can live full lives. Again, I want to look back to Amata saying they can live full lives, they can fully actualize their potential. But we can't do that unless and if we create, we structure the new coalition on the basis of an intersectional analysis. And the last thing I want to say is that we need to acknowledge the special place of indigenous history and the indigenous experience. We need to acknowledge that precisely because it is going to be impossible for us to take intersectionality seriously and not address the implicatedness of some of us as settlers in the colonial project. We cannot talk intersectionality unless and if we acknowledge the extent to which we are complicit in the colonial project. Having said that, I think it's important for us to also realize, though, that we're not all complicit in the same way, in the same ways. We're complicit in different ways, and those distinctions are important to also put in place. Racialized people who are, in many ways, also colonial bodies are complicit in different ways than non-racialized people are. And the challenge that the National Chief was putting up with regard to having a quote-unquote horizontal conversation between some of the people who have perhaps been different types of people who have perhaps been most vulnerable to the nature of the economy today, I think is something that we need to take very, very seriously. But it's not going to be an easy conversation to have.
Thank you. Armine, did you want to comment on that question? Nope. No? Okay, thank you.
Can I just add one point? Can I add one point?
Yes. Oh, yes.
I just would also stress that one of the things that could also be thought about is the fact that we, by and large, buy into the hierarchy, putting ourselves as humans at the top and putting everything else at the bottom, and to think about what might change if we adopted a more indigenous system of understanding the world around us, that we are no more important than the animals that we share the land with, that the water that has a spirit, that the plants that live here. And if we start to think about that and the responsibilities that we have to those beings and that they have responsibilities to us, how might things look different? And I would just put a point that.
Thank you very much for that. I think there's a question right here, please.
Hi, my name is Melinda Smith, and I am from the University of Alberta. I want to ask a question actually to all three speakers. First, I want to thank you for what was a really impressive presentation and an inspirational one. And I want to ask a question about the thorny issue of race or racialization, what in Canada is variously called visible minorities or / non-white. And all of you spoke to it somewhat, and all of you also suggested intersectionality, which means how we can think about the relationship between non-white Canadians, which is the official definition, and Aboriginal people, but also the relationship between settlers, which is probably an uncomfortable word for thinking about people who are otherwise called founding peoples. But my question is this: how do we reinsert into the conversation in a way that's meaningful notions of race when institutions pride themselves, particularly our universities, for example, on being colorblind, right? And secondly, how do we discuss that other thorny issue that all of you addressed about how do we achieve our excellence? How do we discuss the constitutions of excellence in ways that actually tend to erase or remove difference and diversity? Because we always come back to those kinds of questions.
Thank you very much for that question. Tasha, do you want to begin?
Well, I always think about what do we understand things like excellence and success to mean, right? And again, it means, and I guess my issue comes with meritocracy and with the idea of excellence only being an individual success and excellence meaning having the material things. And I guess for me, I always think I'd like to reframe those. I'd really like us to reframe those concepts, to think about I'm really excellent at how I relate to my neighbor. I'm really excellent at how I understand I have a responsibility to make sure that, how many generations down the road my great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be there. I'd like to be really excellent at that. So I just, I think that we need to start rethinking those terms and what they mean and the implications that come with that. And absolutely within institutions, I think that I think all of us need to really push about closing the gap between what's put in a marketing strategy when it comes to institutions and what they're able to contribute for non-white people, for Indigenous people, and have positions of influence to make those changes. That those of us that understand, live both in a lived way and in an academic way what racialization does, have the opportunity to speak to that without being silenced, without being minimized. How exactly that happens, I think there's a lot of strategies. I don't want to. But I think that sadly, I think it has to be a 2-point thing of us pushing and those who are in those positions taking a step back.
Armine, this relates very much, I think, to your presentation. Do you want to comment?
Well, I was trying to think of how to answer you. And I think I want to take the opposite side of your question. You're talking about excellence, and I want to talk about invisibility and how invisibility is growing. So we're making more and more people invisible. Grace Edward talks about the erasure of diversity. But I want to focus just for a minute on the temporary foreign worker thing, which is brand new in our society. Grace Edward also talked about the Chinese that came here to build the railroad, because just like today, Canadians that were here didn't want to do it, and the Chinese were willing to do it, but they came here as landed immigrants. They came here as people that could, however we treated them, they were supposed to be part of who Canada became. They had a stake in the way the country became. And we are now in a place in the world where there's over 200 million people that are leaving their country looking for something better, because where they live is awful. And it looks to me like the search of the last 30 years of all nations was for more capital, right? We are all trying to beggar each other's neighbors to attract money because, whether we're going to extract stuff from the north or extract stuff from wherever, we needed the money to extract the stuff so we could have the jobs, right? The next 30 years, we're going to be looking for people. We're going to need to be people magnets. But at the same time, what is happening is that the bosses are controlling who's let in where. Suddenly, immigration policy is not about building a country. It's about meeting skills shortages. And the people that come here are good enough to do the job, but they're not good enough to stay. They get to leave in 4 years. So what we're creating in Canada for the first time in our history is a cohort of the illegals, that ugly, ugly dialogue that is in the United States, where people don't want to leave because in 4 years you can have a baby. You can actually have a desire to live here and not go back to the country you came from. And people are going underground. So we've got this brand new thing that is happening about making the visible invisible, which is the flip side of the excellence debate. Let's celebrate the best and the brightest. Let's make sure that we can make, more opportunity to let the cream rise to the top, wherever the cream may be found. While at the same time, we're actually making people invisible. We're making their history invisible. We're making their struggles invisible. We're not allowing them to have voice. I mean, you think social media. Shit, everybody can say anything they want, whenever they want, to whoever they want, right? But who's got the ear of the decision makers? Who's talking to the people that are putting these policies in place? That's why this generation of young people has to figure out, how do you get in that sandbox? How do you affect the conversation that people that are making decisions about your future are taking? Right? How do you make your story not invisible? However that is, and that's partly the story of how we are stewarding our beautiful country, the land, the water, the resources of our country. How do we make sure they have a voice too, those elements of our heritage?
Thank you very much, Grace Edward. Grace Edward, please.
So let me just say very quickly with regard to what Armine said, that what we're seeing, and this is why that conversation that we need to have as some of us certainly as immigrants and indigenous people is a difficult conversation is because what we're seeing are global processes of economic disruption and dispossession that in some ways are responsible for the kind of migration that leads people here. And they're connected. They're connected to what's going on here. So we need a much more complex way of dealing with how that's playing out. Secondly, I want to say that I talked a bit about this, that this notion of color blindness has become a logic of denial. It is a logic of denial and erasure. In essence, it undermines the claim that racialized people make about a continuing experience of racialization having real material and psychological and emotional impacts, right? So when young people talk about microaggressions, being confronted in public space by people who, in the way that they interact with them, diminish them, demean them, that's not on the radar. It cannot be because we're in a colorblind society. When people talk about an explanation as to why there are these disparities, racial disparities in income, in access to employment, in health, in contact with the criminal justice system, in who is in jail and who is not, we can't talk about that because we are colorblind society. It forecloses the possibility of us both talking about the experience, it robs us of that voice, and also establishing a basis for public policy. Unger has talked about this as being neither neutral nor natural. It is neither neutral nor natural. And the last thing I want to say is about this concept of meritocracy. Meritocracy, like colorblind, are concepts that are historically conditioned, right? Again, the concept of meritocracy is neither neutral nor natural. It is historically conditioned. And because it is historically conditioned, it is important for us to find a way to confront it. Now, the neoliberals have used it very effectively by saying, really, the market determines the value of people's labor. And if people do not get commensurate access, whether they have education or not, if they don't get commensurate access to opportunity, it is not because of anything to do with the system or the structures or the institutional arrangement. It has to do with the individual pathologies that those individuals, quote unquote, have. But we have to interrogate this notion of meritocracy from a historical standpoint. It's hard to make an argument within a colonial society, right? Given the legacy of colonization, that meritocracy at any given point in time represents equity or even fairness. And the concept of meritocracy at any given point in time represents equity or even fairness, without taking into consideration, for instance, what the National Chief was talking about with regard to indigenous access to education. How could we possibly not take that into consideration and then construct a concept of meritocracy that really, at the end of the day, just simply serves to maintain the order?
Thank you very much. We have one last question. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, I'm Paul from the Six Nation Reserve. I want to give a question to Tasha. I was pretty inspired about the whole education is our buffalo. But one of the many things is I like to say is education is kind of gotten kind of pricey, so most people can't really pay to stay in school, or their band can't really pay to keep them in. So basically, it's like the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Mm-hmm. And speaking in the words of the philosopher Aristotle, knowing yourself is the beginning of all knowledge. And do you still know yourself when you leave your door as a proud Aboriginal, with a good education, and that can help change?
Thank you. Just Tash, I think, on this one, and then we'll close. Thank you.
Hi, Paul. To be very, very honest, I'm out of balance. I'm about 6 months away from a PhD. And I got encouraged. I was lucky I had that had people, like I said, clear space and encourage me. But as far as understanding myself as a Nahio person, I'm not even near that. I'm still in like grade 2. Maybe. I think most days I'm bumbling around like a toddler, but no. And I think that's partly why my research is what it is, because as an educated Indigenous person, I've become aware of that imbalance and the need to right that balance. And so that's why this is so compelling for me, that we've been encouraged to stunt our growth and our knowledge of ourselves as Indigenous people, while we've been pushed to be educated with the end goal only of participating in a market economy, right? That's really all we're ever pushed to. That's the narrative that's out there. And so for me, I want to rebalance that, and so that our education in these institutions reflect, and we see ourselves there, and and the recovery process of ourselves as Indigenous people, you as Siksika, and coming from that space and coming from that history, and me where I come from, and all others, that we right that balance, right? That we become fully actualized. That's a really interesting concept to think about. How do we become that? And I just want to end by I agree completely with Grace Edward that we do need to recover those histories. And when we think about the residential school legacy, it's getting talked about now. When I was a young person, no one talked about it, right? No one talked about it. We're talking about it now. We're talking about the abuse and the atrocities, which absolutely need to be part of the dialogue. But what also needs to be remembered is the legacy of those schools is not just the abuse, not just the trauma, but it's also that, we were those of, there's people my age that went, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. The fallacy out there is that they were getting an education. They were not. There's a lot of people who came out of residential school not having an education, but they sure learned how to work. They sure learned how to work the jobs that now that the temporary foreign workers are doing. We sure learned how to be a servant class. That was also part of the goal that doesn't get talked about when we talk about residential schools and what the people that went through them came out with.
Stephen, can I just say one last thing quickly?
One last, yes, very briefly, please.
And that is, I think it's important for us to leave the young people with a sense of hope. Because when we attempt to critique some of the structures that determine our lives, we are also talking about the need for us to create new structures, the kind of structures that will ensure the full actualization that I was talking about. I remember speaking at an event a few weeks ago, and someone said to me, well, all of what you've said is true, but good Lord, just imagine Martin Luther King going up there in 1963 and saying, I have a nightmare. Right? And so I think it is important for us to have a sense of a dream, the possibilities. And I want to end by quoting from Leanne Simpson, who has a Haudenosaunee prophecy. She says a prophecy of the seventh fire, in which she talks about the coming moment of liberation and the need for us to embrace that moment. And by us, I mean us who are settlers on this land as well. Embrace that moment of liberation. But if it is going to be a moment of liberation for those who have been colonized, then it means that our relationship both to those peoples as well as to the land has to be different.